For centuries, humanity was seen as weak and insignificant, ignored by the galaxy, dismissed by those in power, tolerated only when useful, and forgotten the moment they became inconvenient. To the Galactic Council, humans were a minor species with major opinions. Too young, too loud, too willing to question rules that had governed the stars since before humanity had discovered fire. They challenged authority, resisted hierarchy, and refused to accept that age alone equaled wisdom. That made them irritating. But irritation was not the same as danger. By every metric the Council respected, humanity ranked low. Their fleets were modest. Their technology was adaptive but inelegant. Their political systems were fractured, inefficient, and endlessly debated. Compared to civilizations that measured time in tens of thousands of years, humans were brief sparks, destined to flare and fade. Analysts labeled them low threat. Strategists labeled them manageable. Archivists labeled them temporary. And so the galaxy stopped watching them. When human expansion slowed, it was blamed on internal instability. When trade volumes declined, it was dismissed as mismanagement. When colonies withdrew from shared infrastructure and diplomatic channels went silent, the assumption was comfortable and familiar. Humanity was failing. Species failed all the time. Some collapsed under their own contradictions. Some were absorbed by stronger neighbors. Some simply vanished when the universe stopped accommodating their growth. Humanity, with all its noise and division, seemed destined for the same quiet end. The Council closed the file. No fleets were dispatched to confirm extinction. No observers sent to investigate the growing silence. There were always more pressing matters: border disputes, client species unrest, the endless maintenance of galactic order. Humanity wasn't worth the effort. What the Council never understood was that humanity had never been fragile. They had been dependent. Dependent on trade routes that could be cut. Dependent on permissions that could be revoked. Dependent on systems designed by those who believed control was stability. And when those supports were removed, something fundamental changed. Humanity did not collapse outward in chaos. They collapsed inward. They shed excess. They discarded assumptions. They dismantled structures that existed only to please others. The noise stopped. The broadcasts ended. The arguments faded, not because humanity had died, but because it had begun to focus. While the galaxy mistook silence for extinction, humanity was doing what it had always done best under pressure: adapting. They stopped trying to earn approval from ancient powers that would never see them as equals. They stopped building for prestige and started building for endurance. They stopped asking how to succeed within the galaxy's rules, and began asking how to survive when those rules failed. No one was watching. That was the mistake. Because the most dangerous moment in human history was never their wars, their divisions, or their early expansion. It was the moment the galaxy stopped paying attention, and left humanity alone long enough to become something else entirely. And when humanity finally returned to the galactic stage, the Council didn't welcome them. They panicked. The Galactic Council tightened its grip. Not with fleets or open declarations of hostility, but with policy, quiet, suffocating, and devastatingly precise. Humanity was placed under provisional oversight, a phrase carefully chosen to sound temporary while granting the Council near total control over every remaining point of contact humans had with the wider galaxy. Trade was cut. Human shipping licenses were suspended, pending compliance reviews that never concluded. Entire categories of goods were quietly reclassified as strategic materials: reactor substrates, medical compounds, navigation cores, now denied to human buyers. Dockyards delayed clearances until fuel reserves ran thin. Contracts froze. Credit access vanished behind layers of procedure designed to exhaust rather than resolve. Within months, supply chains that had taken generations to build unraveled. Rights were revoked. Human representatives lost voting privileges in council chambers. Then their right to speak. Then their access entirely. Travel permits were restricted under the guise of security. Surveillance mandates were imposed for protection. Council law, ancient, flexible, and selectively enforced, was suddenly applied with ruthless consistency. Every action was legal. Every justification polished. Every appeal denied. Humanity protested through the channels the Council insisted were appropriate. They cited treaties signed in good faith, mutual defense clauses, shared wars fought side by side. Human fleets had bled alongside Council armadas. Human engineers had rebuilt worlds that were not their own. The Council acknowledged the filings, then archived them. Sanctions tightened further. Insurance guilds raised transit costs until civilian travel became impossible. Navigation beacons along human routes went dark for maintenance. Communication relays lagged, then failed, as service contracts were quietly terminated. Humanity was pushed into isolation, and the Council watched closely. They expected collapse. They had seen the pattern countless times. A species dependent on interstellar trade fractured once cut off. Economies failed. Political rivalries turned violent. Colonies turned on one another over dwindling resources. Refugees flooded outward, begging for reinstatement and protection. Humanity, divided and argumentative by nature, should have shattered first. It didn't. Months passed. Then years. There were no refugee armadas. No mass distress calls. No desperate broadcasts pleading for mercy. Instead, human traffic rerouted inward with unsettling coordination. Peripheral colonies, once dismissed as marginal, suddenly became centers of activity. Council analysts flagged the data as anomalous. Supervisors dismissed it. They assumed humanity was burning through reserves in a final, desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. Dying civilizations often appeared productive just before the end. It fit precedent. It fit expectation. Then human space went quiet. Not the chaotic silence of collapse, but something deliberate. No broadcasts. No demands. No threats. No pleas. To the Council, that silence meant confirmation. Finished. Monitoring files were closed. Observers reassigned. Humanity was quietly reclassified as a non-viable civilization, another entry in the long archive of species that had failed to adapt to galactic order. The Council moved on. They never asked why human industrial output had spiked just before the silence. Never questioned why energy readings rose instead of fell. Never wondered why a collapsing species stopped asking for help altogether. They never considered that humanity might have reached a conclusion of its own. That dependence was weakness. That permission was vulnerability. That survival meant removing every system that could be taken away. The Council believed isolation was a punishment. For humanity, it was a refinement. Every sanction stripped away reliance. Every revoked right burned off illusion. Every closed door forced reinvention. The Council expected collapse. What they created instead was a civilization no longer bound to the galaxy's fragile systems of control, and therefore no longer subject to them. By the time the Council realized the silence wasn't death, humanity was already learning how to return on its own terms. Isolation didn't break humanity. It unified them. At first, there was disbelief, then anger, then fear. Not the loud, panicked kind, but the cold, clarifying kind that forces hard decisions. When the last Council trade lanes closed and the final appeals disappeared into silence, humanity reached a realization that spread across every world they had ever settled. No one was coming. For centuries, humanity had carried its fractures into the stars. Old nations reborn as colonies. Corporate blocs wielding power rivaling governments. Ideologies exported wholesale to planets that had never known Earth. Those divisions endured because the galaxy allowed them to, because trade softened consequences and external authority absorbed the cost of failure. Isolation stripped that protection away. When shipments stopped, ideology didn't matter. When jump routes vanished, borders became meaningless. When Council patrols ignored human distress calls, denial gave way to clarity. Division was no longer inefficient. It was fatal. Old divisions vanished, not through revolution or conquest, but necessity. Arguments that once dragged on for decades were resolved in days, sometimes hours. Not because humanity became gentler, but because survival demanded cooperation. You either worked together, or you didn't survive. Emergency assemblies formed across human space. Not parliaments. Not senates. Coordination councils. They were led not by career politicians, but by people who understood systems, logisticians who kept supply chains alive, engineers who knew what failed first under pressure, medics who understood what shortages actually killed people. The questions were brutally simple. How do we feed everyone? How do we keep power stable? How do we make sure no colony stands alone? Corporations resisted at first. Profit models collapsed without external markets. Some tried hoarding resources, leveraging scarcity for control. They didn't last. Cooperative networks outpaced them within months, sharing materials, data, and labor freely, producing more with less waste. Profit was replaced with continuity. Military forces followed. Fleets that once answered to different flags began operating together out of necessity. Joint patrols became shared commands. Shared commands hardened into permanent structures. Uniforms lost national insignia. Ship hulls lost ownership markings. Culture remained. Identity remained. Authority changed. All colonies stood under one command. It wasn't declared. It wasn't voted on. It emerged. Command was not a government. It did not dictate belief, language, or culture. It coordinated survival. When command issued a directive, it was followed, not out of loyalty, but because it worked. Power grids synchronized. Food production stabilized. Manufacturing standards unified. A ship built in one system could be repaired in another without modification. Medical protocols standardized across worlds. Mortality rates dropped even as resources tightened. Redundancy replaced efficiency. Resilience replaced optimization. Humanity stopped functioning like competing states. They began functioning like a single organism. Education shifted almost overnight. Children learned systems thinking before history. Emergency response before politics. Every human learned something practical: fabrication, repair, medicine, logistics. Knowing how to keep something running became as fundamental as language. This wasn't militarization. It was preparation. Because if no one else would protect them, they would protect themselves. Defense replaced borders. Early warning arrays stretched far beyond mapped space, watching vectors no council doctrine had ever considered threats. Humanity assumed betrayal as a baseline. They assumed isolation would return. They assumed help would not arrive in time. So they built accordingly. The galaxy never noticed. Council observers had been reassigned. Sensor coverage reduced. Reports hinting at unusual coordination were buried under bureaucracy or dismissed as statistical noise. Humanity faded from relevance exactly as the Council expected. And humanity did nothing to correct that assumption. They had learned the value of being underestimated. While the Council congratulated itself on a problem solved, human space grew quieter and stronger. Colonies once separated by light years functioned like neighboring districts. Decisions that once took generations were made in days. Not through tyranny. Through shared responsibility. Isolation had done what centuries of diplomacy never could. It removed the illusion that someone else would step in. In its place, humanity built unity not from ideology, but necessity. Not from obedience, but trust. And when the galaxy finally turned its attention back toward human space, when humanity returned, unified and silent, the Council panicked. Because they were no longer looking at a fractured species. They were looking at something whole. In silence, humanity evolved. Cut off from the galaxy's noise, human space did not decay, it refined itself. There were no announcements, no demonstrations meant to impress observers who were no longer watching. Progress stopped being performative. It became intentional. New engines came first. Humanity abandoned the galaxy's dependence on hyperspace lanes and artificial shortcuts through reality. Those systems were fast, elegant, and fragile. They relied on infrastructure that could be sanctioned, gated, or destroyed. Human engineers chose something slower and far more reliable: endurance. They built engines that pushed directly against spacetime itself, converting mass, time, and relentless persistence into motion. Inefficient by Council metrics. Brutal on materials. Impossible to optimize for spectacle. But they never failed. Human ships no longer required lanes, gates, or permissions. If space existed, they could cross it. Travel became inevitable rather than conditional. They didn't arrive suddenly. They arrived eventually, and nothing could stop them. Unbreakable shields followed. Not graceful energy veils meant to win short, theatrical battles, but layered systems of brutal redundancy. Fields nested within fields, reinforced by mass, geometry, and adaptive algorithms. Human shields did not try to negate damage. They accepted it. Energy dispersed, rerouted, bled harmlessly into space. Kinetic force slowed, spread, and died. Every impact fed data back into the system, refining responses in real time. Each strike made the shield stronger than before. Hull plating thickened until ships resembled drifting continents. Armor wasn't decorative, it was grown, replaced, and grown again. Vital systems were buried beneath entire ecosystems: farms, reservoirs, fabrication bays, medical wards. Even catastrophic damage became survivable. Human ships stopped being vehicles. They became habitats that moved. Fleets were built, but not for conquest. There were no banners painted on hulls. No heroic names etched into armor. Ships were identified by function and redundancy, not legacy. Ark-class vessels safeguarded populations. Foundry fleets manufactured replacements mid-transit. Defense lattices functioned as mobile terrain rather than aggressive spearheads. Every loss was anticipated. Every role replaceable. Every ship expendable, except the people inside. Weapons existed, but they were tools, not symbols. Interdiction fields to halt advance. Area denial arrays to make approach prohibitively costly. Precision null systems designed to remove threats cleanly and permanently. Humanity did not build weapons to inspire fear. They built weapons to end danger. While the galaxy looked away, humanity prepared. Artificial intelligence, once feared, once restricted, was rebuilt under unforgiving principles. No gods. No masters. Partners only. Every system assumed error rather than perfection, betrayal rather than loyalty, failure rather than success. Human oversight was mandatory. Human responsibility absolute. Biology advanced alongside steel. Human physiology adapted quietly. Radiation tolerance increased. Cellular repair accelerated. Immune systems became aggressive, self-updating networks. Humans didn't become visibly different. They became harder to kill. Generations grew up inside this preparation. Children learned fabrication and repair alongside language and mathematics. Emergency response became basic education. Knowing how to keep something running became as fundamental as reading. This was not militarization. It was survival literacy. Beyond human space, the galaxy remained unaware. The Council was busy managing politics, suppressing dissent, and congratulating itself on stability. Data that contradicted humanity's supposed collapse was filtered, reinterpreted, or quietly discarded. It was easier not to look. And so the galaxy never saw the fleets forming beyond known maps. Never saw engines that ignored borders. Never saw shields that endured forces capable of shattering moons. Never saw a civilization that had stopped seeking approval and started building permanence. By the time humanity returned, by the time the Council finally realized the silence had not been emptiness, humanity was no longer preparing to survive. They were prepared. And that realization was what truly made the Council panic. Then a new enemy appeared. There was no warning. No declaration transmitted across diplomatic channels. One cycle, the outer systems reported routine traffic and stable star lanes. The next, those systems were screaming, and then they were gone. The first world fell in less than a day. Long-range sensors captured fragments of the event before failing entirely. Massive spatial distortions, fleets emerging without lanes, ships that ignored every known law of propulsion. The invaders were colossal and asymmetrical, grown rather than constructed, their hulls shifting as if alive. They called themselves the Dominion. Worlds fell. Council defense fleets scrambled, arriving only to find debris fields where orbital cities had once hung. Moons were dismantled for raw material. Planetary crusts were split open with industrial precision. Atmospheres burned not as targets, but as waste heat. The Dominion did not conquer. They harvested. Entire systems were stripped and abandoned, left silent and lifeless. Borders meant nothing. Treaties meant nothing. The Dominion advanced with relentless efficiency, consuming everything useful and discarding the rest. Species were enslaved. Survivors were processed with mechanical indifference. Engineers were implanted with control nodes and forced to maintain Dominion warforms. Soldiers were chemically altered, stripped of identity, and thrown back into battle as disposable shock units. Civilian populations were reduced to labor stock, biological components feeding an ever-expanding machine. Those deemed unnecessary were erased. Refugees poured into council space carrying stories too horrific to dismiss. Worlds turned into processing hubs. Cultures erased not through massacre, but repurposing. Entire histories ended without a single memorial. The galaxy panicked. The Galactic Council convened emergency sessions that stretched on for cycles. Representatives shouted over one another, demanding action while assigning blame. Ancient powers argued jurisdiction. Younger species begged for protection. Military blocs refused to commit fleets without guarantees of reimbursement and command authority. The Council argued while systems burned. Votes were proposed. Votes were delayed. Votes were vetoed. Coalitions formed on paper and collapsed in practice. Fleets mobilized too slowly, bound by doctrines built for controlled wars, not extinction. Every decision required consensus, and consensus arrived only after another star went dark. When Council armadas finally met the Dominion in force, the outcome was catastrophic. Entire fleets vanished. Flagships were torn apart mid-transmission. The Dominion sacrificed ships freely, learning from every encounter, adapting faster than Council tacticians could respond. Weapons that had once decided wars barely slowed them. Within a few short cycles, the truth became impossible to deny. The Council was losing. Worse, they had no plan left. That was when analysts noticed something strange. On Dominion expansion maps, there was a void. A vast region of space they did not enter. Not fortified. Not contested. Simply avoided. Advance vectors curved around it. Probes altered course without explanation. Entire Dominion fleets diverted as if responding to a threat no one could detect. That region bordered human space. The realization spread through the Council chamber like a vacuum breach. Humanity. A species the Council had isolated. Silenced. Written off as finished. And yet, something about them had caused an empire that devoured stars to hesitate. Panic followed understanding. Reluctantly, desperately, the Council turned to the name they had never intended to speak again. Dormant channels were reactivated. Deprecated frequencies restored. Messages were drafted with extreme care, layered with apology and urgency. Past disagreements were acknowledged. Shared extinction-level risk emphasized. Unity and survival invoked again and again. The first message went unanswered. So did the second. Worlds continued to fall. Finally, stripped of pride and pretense, the Council broadcast a single, unfiltered transmission across every channel humanity had ever used. "We need your help." The reply came minutes later. Not from an ambassador. Not from a politician. From a calm, steady voice identified only as command. "We know," the voice said. "We've been watching." Relief swept through the chamber. Councilors spoke at once, offering everything that had once been denied: restored rights, full reintegration, shared authority, permanent seats, emergency command. The human voice cut through the noise. "You isolated us. You revoked our rights. You expected us to collapse," command said. "We didn't. What's happening now is not our responsibility." Panic erupted. "If the Dominion wins," a councilor pleaded, "humanity will fall as well." There was a pause, long enough to feel endless. "Yes," command replied. "Eventually." Hope flared. "So you'll help." "We didn't say that," the voice answered. "We said we understand the threat." Council displays changed. Data flooded the chamber. Dominion logistics, behavioral models, structural weaknesses mapped with unsettling precision. Entire campaigns already simulated. Failure points identified. Casualty projections calculated down to decimals. Humanity hadn't just been observing. They had been preparing. "We will engage the Dominion," Command said at last, "because extinction-level threats do not respect borders." Relief washed through the Council. "But understand this," the voice continued, colder now. "This is not a rescue." A pause. "This is why you panicked when we returned." The transmission ended, and as Dominion fleets closed in on the heart of the galaxy, the Council finally understood the truth behind its fear. Humanity had not returned seeking forgiveness. They had not returned seeking power. They had returned because something had finally proven the galaxy wrong, and shown why humanity should never have been underestimated. The Council expected forgiveness. They believed desperation erased history, that when extinction loomed close enough, old crimes would soften into misunderstandings. Humanity, they assumed, would be furious, but grateful, ready to rejoin, ready to obey, ready to help. They were wrong. What the Council found instead was resolve. When dormant human channels suddenly came alive, the Council chamber erupted. Delegates spoke over one another, scrambling to offer what had once been stripped away: restored rights, permanent council seats, shared command authority, reparations approved without debate. Concessions that had taken centuries to deny were offered in minutes. Humanity listened. Then they answered calmly, "We will decide when to act." The words struck harder than any refusal. Council representatives protested immediately. Time was running out. Every delay meant another world lost, another species enslaved. They demanded timelines, fleet deployments, guarantees, anything that sounded like control. They were given none. "Urgency did not save you," the human voice continued, "identified only as command. It blinded you. We will not repeat that mistake." The transmission ended. Silence followed, thick and terrifying. For the first time in galactic history, survival no longer rested on ancient authority or collective vote. It rested on the judgment of a species the Council had once dismissed as weak, and that species was not rushing. Far beyond charted space, something began to move. In regions long marked as empty, where gravity maps blurred and sensors returned meaningless static, human constructs awakened. Frameworks seeded during the earliest days of isolation came online in perfect synchronization, responding to signals that had never been broadcast. Foundries ignited. Stars were tapped, not consumed, not destroyed, but shaped. Their output redirected into controlled torrents of energy feeding colossal structures wrapped in reinforced spacetime fields. Fleets long hidden aligned along vectors no Council doctrine had ever charted. Soon after, space itself began to tremble. Not from hyperspace ruptures. Not from weapons fire. From strain. Across the galaxy, sensors screamed as localized distortions appeared in synchronized patterns light-years apart. Reality flexed, stabilized, then flexed again, like a structure being tested far beyond its original limits. Humanity was not mobilizing. They were initializing. The Council finally understood the difference. Whatever humanity was preparing was not a desperate response to the Dominion. It was a solution conceived long ago, refined in silence, and held in reserve for a moment exactly like this. The Dominion qualified. Whether the Council did was no longer relevant. Humanity had not returned seeking forgiveness. They had not returned to reclaim status or demand restitution. They had returned because something existed that threatened continuity itself. And when they finally acted, it would not be because the Council begged. It would be because humanity had finished deciding how the future of the galaxy would be written. Human fleets emerged in perfect silence. There was no warning flare, no hyperspace rupture, no energetic signature for sensors to lock onto. One moment, Dominion armadas filled the void, vast, predatory formations advancing toward the final core systems. The next moment, humanity was there. Space did not tear open. It gave way. Massive human constructs unfolded along impossible vectors, occupying positions the Dominion had never considered threatened. Arc ships the size of moons anchored the formation, their gravity wells stabilizing space around them. Lattice-like defense platforms stretched across entire approach corridors, turning open void into controlled terrain. Foundry fleets aligned in the rear, already producing replacements for losses that had not yet occurred. They were massive. They were precise. They were unstoppable. Human vessels emitted nothing recognizable. No drive plumes. No weapons charging. Dominion targeting systems failed to acquire locks, returning contradictory data, as if the human fleet existed slightly outside the frame of reference the Dominion understood. They did not advance. They waited. Then a single message crossed every channel. Unencrypted. Unfiltered. Translated instantly into every known language. Stand down. The Dominion answered with annihilation. Entire formations surged forward, sacrificing themselves to break the human line. Planet cracker lances fired. Reality-warping weapons detonated. Space burned white as the Dominion unleashed everything it had ever used to erase resistance. The human fleet did not move. Their shields flexed, layered systems absorbing, dispersing, and nullifying forces that had shattered stars. Energy bled away into harmless radiation. Kinetic impacts slowed, spread, and died. Human hulls did not glow. Armor did not fracture. Humanity endured. Then they responded. Not with rage. With correction. Regions of space hardened. Dominion ships slowed, then stopped entirely, trapped in volumes where physics itself refused to cooperate. Propulsion systems failed. Weapons shut down mid-cycle. Entire fleets froze mid-charge like insects suspended in amber. Human counterfire began. It was not a barrage. It was removal. Dominion vessels vanished one by one, erased by localized null events that left no debris, no explosion, only absence. Command ships disappeared first. Control nodes followed. Each strike eliminated something essential, unraveling the enemy's structure with surgical precision. The Dominion attempted to adapt. They always did. But there was nothing to adapt to. Human tactics did not escalate. They did not change. They remained constant, methodical, as if the outcome had been calculated long before the first ship appeared. Retreat vectors collapsed before they could be used. Reinforcements never arrived. Communication across Dominion formations degraded into static, then silence. Then the Dominion's command intelligence, an entity believed to span multiple dimensions, went dark. No death cry. No final transmission. It simply stopped. The war ended before the enemy understood it had begun. Across the galaxy, Council sensors struggled to process what they were witnessing. Battles that should have lasted centuries concluded in minutes. Systems once doomed to fall went quiet, not occupied, not conquered, but spared. Human fleets did not pursue. They powered down. A final transmission followed, brief and absolute. The threat has been neutralized. Do not pursue remnants. And then humanity withdrew. Space relaxed. Physics resumed its familiar shape. Human ships vanished as cleanly as they had arrived, leaving behind silence, and survivors who barely understood why they were still alive. The Galactic Council watched in stunned disbelief. Because at last, they understood the source of their panic. Humanity had not returned to fight a war. They had returned to end one. And they had done it so completely that the galaxy itself barely noticed it had been saved. The Council tried to reclaim control. In the aftermath of the Dominion's erasure, emergency decrees flooded the chambers. Borders were reaffirmed. Authority was restated. Committees formed to oversee reconstruction, threat assessment, and post-crisis governance. The Council spoke as if order had survived because of its wisdom, as if the system had worked all along. It was too late. The galaxy remembered. Worlds remembered the silence while they burned. Species remembered the debates that outlasted entire civilizations. Survivors remembered who hesitated and who arrived. The Council still had fleets. They still had laws. They still had ancient halls heavy with tradition. But power had shifted. Humanity did not step forward to rule. They refused every offer. Permanent council seats. Supreme military authority. Emergency governance over liberated systems. Each proposal was acknowledged, considered, and declined with the same calm finality. "We are not here to govern," came the final human transmission. Governance creates dependence. Dependence creates failure. Instead, humanity shared what they had learned. Stabilization frameworks capable of repairing planetary damage once thought irreversible. Defensive architectures designed to prevent extinction rather than provoke war. Infrastructure models built on redundancy instead of efficiency. Systems meant to endure betrayal, abandonment, and isolation. They helped rebuild. Then they left. Humanity did not replace the Council. They made it optional. Across the galaxy, doctrines changed. Species stopped assuming someone else would protect them. Defense replaced prestige. Preparation replaced complacency. The comforting illusion that safety could be outsourced, to ancient powers, to treaties, to distant authorities, began to die. The Council still existed, but it no longer defined survival. And humanity, they faded back into the dark. Not hiding, not isolated, waiting. Human space remained distant and undefined, its borders unmapped, its fleets unseen. They did not occupy trade routes. They did not demand recognition. They existed beyond known space, where sensors strained and certainty failed. Watching, listening, enduring. The Council never tried to silence humanity again. They never dared. Because the galaxy now understood a truth that could not be debated or forgotten. Humanity did not need to rule to matter. They did not need permission to act. They did not need gratitude to protect existence. They had survived abandonment. They had endured isolation. They had ended an extinction-level threat without becoming conquerors. And that redefined power forever. So when the stars finally grew quiet again, when the Dominion became a memory instead of a terror, one certainty spread across the galaxy, whispered between worlds and etched into every serious archive. If darkness rises again, if something ancient, merciless, or unimaginable reaches for the stars, humanity will be there. Not as rulers, not as saviors seeking praise, but as the reason the galaxy learned to be afraid of silence, and to respect the ones who return from it.